Here, read this.
Woof.
If you are a author completist and you haven't yet checked out Delphi Classics, I highly recommend you do. They, if you don't know, they publish the complete works of authors, usually for about £1 or £2 in ebook form. I don't quite understand how they do it, because sometimes they seem to publish authors that I don't think have fallen out of copyright quite. They recently published the complete works of Chandler, who I'm sure is still under copyright. So how they make it make financial sense, I have no idea. It feels a bit wrong, but they're great. And for... This isn't sponsored, by the way. I wish it was. I mean, I don't think they can afford me, but when they're selling the complete works of H.G. Wells for 99p. For a fan of H.G. Wells like myself, who's read a good amount of novels, maybe about a dozen of his novels, but he wrote 51, I think. A bunch of collections of short stories and a lot of non-fiction as well. So to have it all in one handy place is great. And after making the financial commitment to that 99p, I've been working through his novels, reading some I've never read before, and rereading some that I just haven't read for a long time. And today I wanted to talk just quickly, just make some preliminary remarks about one of his novels that I had read and have just reread. And it's one of his very famous novels. It's called The Island of Dr. Moreau. It's an early novel, one that H.G. Wells called an exercise in youthful blasphemy. Our hero is called Edward Prendick. It's actually one of these frame stories that were very fashionable at the time, a bit like The Time Machine, actually. So it starts off with his nephew, I believe, saying that his uncle had been found adrift at sea in 1888, but after his death, they have found a written version of his memoir, I suppose, of his time on the island of Dr. Moreau. His nephew suggests that the only island close to where he was is Noble's Isle, as a Noble Isle is actually populated by human-animal hybrids created by the titular Moreau. Moreau is a scientist, a sort of disgraced scientist. Prendick has a scientific background as well and recalls stories about Moreau's horrors. Specifically, he is a vivisectionist, so he's grafting bits of animals onto one another. He is particularly interested in taking an animal and giving it human qualities through skin grafts. And Wells wrote somewhere that some of this vivisection stuff was quite plausible. Other people argued with him, but he was convinced. And Moreau mentions at one point in the novel, I think it's like a rat that has a tail grafted to its nose, and then that grew into a new species of tail-nosed rats. It's pretty gross. It's quite horrifying, especially certain sequences. This should say straight off, it contains quite a lot of not just torture, but kind of reflections on torture. We'll come back to that when I start talking about the plot. Moreau is cruel. He's described as sort of white-faced and terrible. And he holds a status on this island a little bit like Kurtz from Heart of Darkness. And in fact, the similarities between Conrad's Kurtz and H.G. Wells's Moreau was actually used to convince Marlon Brando to take the role of Moreau in the infamously disastrous 1990s production of The Island of Dr. Moreau. As you can probably expect, the novel is about what sets us apart from animals, what defines our humanity, where our morality is. Moreau talks about the trickiest part of trying to make these animal-human hybrids is trying to locate the emotional center of humans. But for me, what makes it most interesting is it's also about artistic tyranny. I've seen Moreau described in some reviews as being sort of like a proto-eugenicist, like someone who is trying to craft a new race, which strikes me as completely wrong, because he's not that organized. He's not that, what's the right word? Not disciplined. He doesn't really have a plan, it seems. It seems like he's following slightly deranged artistic impulses, and the way he talks about his own work is very much like a struggling artist. He sees himself as an artist, and his canvas is, these tormented bodies. He's a bit like, he's in the camp of, camp being the operative word, of like James Bond villains who see themselves as artists. He's dangerous for all of those reasons. I don't really see where the eugenics thing comes in, because he's not really trying to... He says at one point that the reason that he says, I could try and turn sheep into llamas or llamas into sheep, but I chose the human figure because it's the one that is the most artistic. The human form is the most artistic form. So I think the sort of whiff of eugenics comes from perhaps like a superficial resemblance to a figure like Joseph Mengele and links to Nazism, but obviously this is good half century before the Nazis. And having read a few of other Wells books around this period, the tyranny of an artist is clearly on his mind. I've got another video coming out on a completely different novel, which was much easier to enjoy, not as much torture scenes, where almost incongruously the theme of artistic tyranny keeps entering into the novel. But there's a lot that's really clever in The Island of Dr. Moreau. First off, Wells puts Prendick through a lot before he reaches Moreau. He is shipwrecked, very quickly put in a sort of custom of the sea situation where he and a few other shipwreck survivors are drawing straws until he is rescued, and the ship that rescues him is carrying Montgomery, who is Moreau's assistant. He has various animals that he is bringing back for Moreau to experiment on, including, importantly, a puma. In fact, around this section of the novel, before we've even got to Moreau's island, there was one of the maddest sentences I've read all year, which I think I will just read out for you. As I came up the ladder, I saw against the flushed sky, for the sun was just rising, the broad back and red hair of the captain, and over his shoulder the puma, spinning from a tackle rigged onto the mizzen spanker boom. If one sentence could ever recommend that you read a novel, it has to be that. So Prendick he's at an all-time low. He's in the perfect... Wells is putting him into the perfect frame of mind to reach the island of Dr. Moreau and be so worn down with despair that he will sort of accept the strangenesses that he is about to witness. And there's some other clever little hints, apart from the custom of the sea, about the loss of humanity before we even get to Moreau's island. Other more tawdry or commonplace ways of losing your humanity. Alcoholism, which we first see in that flame-haired captain, but we also will see in the case of Montgomery. Montgomery repeatedly says, I'm not sure if he ever quite explains it, that the reason that life has turned out the way it has for him is that he lost his head one foggy night. So there's references to a crime where he sort of undid himself. Now, when Prendick is brought to the island, he meets Moreau, and he overhears the puma being vivisected, which is grotesque. And but there is cleverness to the grimness of it. As the night wears on, and the vivisecting session continues. I'm not sure if it's over a few days or it's just a very long night. But the emotional appeal of the cries that Prendick is hearing was growing on him. And at first, this sounds, that perhaps he's regaining some of his empathy after his troubles at sea, and he's beginning to feel for the cries of a puma. But what we learn later on is that this puma is taking on, through Moreau's experiments and procedures, taking on human elements. So it's not the emotional appeal of a puma's cries; it is the increasing humanity in them, perhaps. We do meet several of Moreau's failed experiments, who he has cast away as an artist does with his failures. Moreau's efforts, he says, always fall short of the things he dreams. I mean, that's right out of the struggling artist's playbook, isn't it? Prendick meets a lot of the hybrid creatures that Moreau has cast off, and they have formed a sort of rudimentary society based around worship of and fearful worship of Moreau. Montgomery is sort of a bit soft on them, and Prendick is quite repulsed at first. There is a pretty ghoulish descriptions of sort of fleshy, pink, sloth-like creatures. Quite a funny one of a woman who was made out of bits of bear and vixen who Prendick hated immediately, or something. The turning point in the novel is Moreau's death, which comes fairly early on, and leaving the balance of power on the island sort of up for grabs. There is on the side of the humans, there is Montgomery, who is useless and an alcoholic, and Prendick, who, thinking on his feet, turns Moreau into a god, knowing that fear of Moreau is the only thing that keeps the hybrids sort of safe. He says, no, he's not dead, he's watching over you, and that just about holds out long enough for him to start thinking about plans of escape. Some bits around this section I really, really like. One of the hybrids is described at one point as a lump of mystery, and it reminded me a little bit of lump is a word used often in the early the creation story in places like Ovid, when the world was a featureless lump. King Richard in Richard III is described as a detested lump, a sort of foul, miscreated creature. So it gives it that sort of classical sort of horror of chaos. And once Moreau is dead, and we've got that tyranny of artistic curiosity out of the way, there's quite an interesting switch where at one point Prendick is considering suicide, but it's actually only curiosity that keeps him around. He says something at one point that's along the lines of, I only stuck around to sort of see how all this plays out. Almost like, he's almost a bit of a meta comment, see how this novel pans out, see where Wells is going with all this. So curiosity, whether artistic or scientific, is sort of presented as this amoral quality that then can be incredibly destructive, but also life-preserving. After the switch, after Prendick sort of takes over the island rather precariously, there's this wonderful reversal of his initial disgust at the beastly qualities in these humanoids. As the beasts start to regress and become more and more animal-like, go around on all fours, their hair grows back, they eat other animals, they mate in front of him. What horrifies him the most is the pitiful shreds of humanity in the regressing animals. So the odd idiosyncrasy from its phase as a human, a brief effort to walk erect, snatches of conversation. After his escape from the island, Prendick spends his days surrounded by wise books, bright windows in this life of ours, lit by the shining souls of men. Something perhaps to keep his humanity intact. Definitely recommend Island of Dr. Moreau. I realise I've sort of spoiled the plot. I will put a warning up on screen because I realise I didn't say that. It's an entertaining slice of youthful blasphemy, and I think very interesting in the scheme of H.G. Wells' early novels. That's about it for today. I'll leave a link to my podcast on the Time Machine, which is to date my only sort of long form bit of Wells media. But I will be back soon with another video on a very different novel, but written around the same time. And I think that's it. That's all from me. Thanks for watching, and happy reading.